Hey there, I'm Jake Teren, and this is another segment of Office Hours. And this week we're joined by Professor Spechler. She's been a professor of political science focusing on Russia here at IU. And I just want to thank you for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
Well, you hit it in my office hours. So. Okay.
But what I really wanted to know was there like a moment in your life that kind of sparked you to start in Russia, because you're from here, from here in the U.S.
Yeah.
But what got you started wanting to focus on Russia?
What got me started was the second half of my youth, I guess you could say. I grew up in Los Angeles at a time when the political complexion of Los Angeles was very different from what it is today. It was very conservative. And at that time, there was some kind of ordinance, and I don't know, I never learned whether it was a city council ordinance or county or school district, but there was some kind of rule that teachers were not allowed to mention communist China in the classroom. So the United States hadn't recognized communist China. Communism was anathema, and the idea was that you just don't talk about it, that communist China was going to crumble of its own evil accord, and in the meantime, we're not going to educate about it. Well, I was a bit of a rebel, and the idea that there were this vast area of the globe with all these people, and we couldn't acknowledge that it existed or teach about it. And also, I had managed to get my hands on some early Marx essays that seemed beautiful. I mean, Marx had a wonderful idea about a society in which nobody had to specialize. You could be a scholar in the morning and a fisherman or hunter in the afternoon, and paint in the evening. And the principle of from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, struck me as a very good way to run a society. So I thought, what are all these grown-ups, doing when they're condemning communism? What's wrong with communism? So I wanted to grow up and get to college and escape from this school system and learn about communist countries. And at that time, my real interest was in communist China, because it was this, we could talk about the Soviet Union, the United States recognized it in the 1930s, but China, no. So that's what I wanted to do, and I actually did. I mean, my freshman year in college, the very first research paper I wrote was on an American foreign policy course, and it was on the American decision not to recognize communist China. And then I decided that for other reasons that I wanted to go on to graduate school and teach political science. And it was a question of, I always knew I wanted to focus on one communist country or countries, a group of countries. Which was it going to be? And there were two things that lured me from China to the Soviet Union. One was I was given advice, which turns out to have been perhaps bad advice, that if I tried to study Chinese, it would be years and years before I could even read a newspaper, much less do research on it. And anyway, I couldn't go there, so it'd be very hard to do research on it. So I was discouraged from that point of view. And also, I met my husband, who was going into economics, and we wanted to specialize on the same area of the world so that we'd have something to talk about.
Yes.
And he was interested in studying an industrialized economy. Okay. And at that point in time, China was a backward, two-bit, large, but very backward developing economy. So we compromised that we would both specialize on the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc more broadly. And that's how I got into that.
Yeah. Have you ever been able to visit?
Oh, yeah, the Soviet Union.
Okay.
Yes, China I've never been to. My own deficiency. I mean, I just did not take the initiative and arrange that kind of trip. But Soviet Union and Russia I've been to. Yeah.
Was it your readings or was it your travels that have kind of let you kind of focus in on what you're teaching now?
Oh, that has a story of its own. So when I started studying the Soviet Union, I specialized on Soviet domestic affairs, and I did that because what intrigued me about the Soviet Union was how a country translates Marxist doctrine into practice.
Okay.
And also, as I began studying the Soviet Union and reading for myself, I began to realize, what a dictatorship was like, and that was fascinating to me. So what moves a dictator? What moves a dictator? How does a dictator rule? How does a dictator stay in power and, induce others to follow him? Is it entirely based on force? That seemed unlikely, unwieldy and unlikely. So the whole project of the Soviet regime, how it functioned, how it obtained support, how it obtained legitimacy, whether it succeeded in obtaining legitimacy, was fascinating. So I was focusing on that. And then, fairly early on in my career, not long after I finished my dissertation and finished graduate school and I went out into the job market, my husband and I moved to the Middle East, and we taught for 8 years in the Middle East. And there, what people were interested in the Soviet Union, but much more in Soviet foreign policy. What was the Soviet Union doing in the Middle East?
Yeah.
What were its interests? What explains why were they arming the Syrians and the Egyptians? It was known by that time that the Soviets almost single-handedly started the Six-Day War by transmitting false intelligence to the Egyptians and the Syrians about alleged Israeli movements on the Golan. And why would they do that? What's the motivation for the Soviets? What do they have against us? The Soviet Union had been the first country, actually, to recognize the new state of Israel. So this was particularly in Israel. What do they have against us? That they're arming to the teeth with very modern weaponry, these two sworn enemies of ours. So that's what people wanted to know about.
Yeah.
And that's what people cared about. And, as a teacher, I adapted to the interests of, and that's how I got involved in studying international relations. It had been a sort of minor focus of mine up until then. Sort of communist domestic politics had been my focus. But I began more and more to study international behavior and international relations, and that was career changing.
Yeah. Would you say with Russia you found, it sounds like there's something always happening there, and does that help? Does that help just keep you interested and wanting to keep on moving forward? And have you ever felt like you have like a real grasp of it at any time in your career?
Those are separate questions.
Yeah.
So, yes, there's always something interesting going on, either domestically or, just today I walked into class and one of my students said, have you heard about the uprising and protests in Armenia, which is an object of great Russian interest? And no, I hadn't. And, tell me about it.
Yeah,
right?
please.
And that actually relates to your second question, do I ever feel like I'm on top of it? No, I don't. Maybe if I lived there full time and spent more time there, I would, but I'm not sure I would. For one thing, it's Russia is a country of rumors. I don't know if if others have found this to be the case, but it's my experience. The Russians, like Middle Easterners, thrive on conspiracy theories. And by now it's become state policy to invent conspiracy theories explaining what just about everybody that you don't like or any action you don't like are responsible for. Russia thrives and Russian politics thrives on rumors. And so I'm never quite sure that I really know what's going on or why it's going on. Recently we had a very distinguished Russia expert at IU, Celeste Wallander, went to this wonderful conference on America and the world. And she came and spoke to my class. And her take on Russian politics is the most cynical I've ever heard. That what you've got is a clique of extremely corrupt bosses in power who care only about their own power, nothing else, and their own enrichment. And everything that Putin does in international affairs can be explained by his desire to hang on to his own riches and those of his cronies. Well, I think it's too simple, but she could be right. How would I test it? I don't know. I start with other explanations that are not contradictory but different. So I'm never quite sure that I really know what I'm talking about when I explain Russian policy.
Yeah, it's always changing.
Yeah, right.
With those conspiracy theories, is it like the propaganda that's in the news all the time?
Well, now the regime is using, for example, what was the latest about? The poisoning in this episode in London was actually engineered by the United States in order to embarrass the Russians and justify additional sanctions, which are what American policymakers or American hawks wanted to do in the first place. So it was actually the Americans that arranged the poisoning and are responsible for that whole episode. So, yeah.
Wow, so conspiracy theories, they hold more weight than they even do here in the U.S.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, we're new at it. The Russians have been doing this for a long time. In part, it's founded on ignorance. So it used to be a joke in the Soviet Union. The two main newspapers were Pravda and Izvestia. Pravda means truth and Izvestia means news. And so the joke was there's no news in Pravda, there's no truth in Pravda, and no news in Izvestia. And so if that's the case, whom do you believe? What do you believe? Another apocryphal, but I think could be real story, was that at the time of the Six-Day War, the Soviet Jewry was deathly afraid that Israel would be destroyed. But they knew that Israel was doing well when the Soviet papers reported the victories of great Soviet allies in the Middle East and great victories of Soviet allies in the Middle East. So then Soviet Jews knew that Israel must in fact be doing very well, thank you. Months later they found out that was correct.
Wow. Well, I might change it up for just that.
Sure.
So I wanted to ask you, with your time as a professor at Harvard, and when you're a Harvard professor, do you find yourself like walking a different way than you would being a professor here at IU? And do you find, okay, are there any professors like that, or is it?
No.
Okay.
No. Russia is populated, Harvard is populated by very, very bright people who aren't going around thinking the whole time, I'm at Harvard. Many of them are in the clouds thinking about their own research or what's going on in their laboratory that they have to go live in for the next 48 hours or that sort of thing. So they are very, very bright, very engaging because they're interested, usually people in a wide range of topics. No. I did encounter the phenomenon of somewhat arrogant students.
That's,
for faculty, no, but students who sort of felt, wow, I'm at Harvard, and were a little bit perhaps more impressed with themselves than they should have been. Or some of them it was justifiable for them to have been impressed with themselves, what can I say? But no, not a whole different animal or breed of human being.
Do you notice like there being a difference with the students at Harvard, like besides arrogance? With students from IU or Harvard, is there like as big as a gap?
Look, there is a difference in native intelligence. So I've taught students here that are every bit as bright and competent as any student I ever taught at Harvard, but the range here is enormous. And the range of ambitions. Harvard students tend to be more ambitious. Whatever it is, the future that they see for themselves, they see themselves as capable of achieving that. So a lot more self-confidence. Not all. I mean, there's a sizable portion, usually the women, who think, and I remember this very clearly, I was in this group, that felt when they got there as students that we were the ones about whom they made a mistake, right? And you do encounter that as well. But typically, these are people who aim higher. And in general, I would say there's a culture here of sort of partying and alcohol that simply did not exist there. I'm not quite sure whether it does now, but it did not then. And so I won't say that everybody was 100% serious about his studies. We had people who were passionately interested in other things. For example, I had friends who were theater buffs and who were actors and spent all their time hanging out at their equivalent of the MAC or something of that sort. Or people who were artists and spent all their time in some studio painting. People who were passionate about social work. So there were many opportunities at Harvard. The students have a center called the Phillips Brooks House, which focuses on helping students find ways to serve in the larger Boston metropolitan area.
Okay.
And there were people who I think spent 23 out of every 24 hours of their day at the Phillips Brooks House working with others and starting marvelous programs to help prisoners, to help the poor, to help new immigrants, refugees, amazing array of projects. So people, it's not that everybody is studying, but I would say that everybody is doing something that has a serious element to it, that isn't just partying or goofing off. Some everybody, now there are a few of those, but even at my time, there was already a drug culture, a different drug culture. This was the era of LSD, Timothy Leary, whatever it was, turn off, tune in, whatever he had people doing. And I did have some friends who, because I was interested in philosophy at the time, some of my philosophy friends were also very interested in, whatever it is, tuning in and turning off and
Did you ever meet Leary?
I met Leary once, yeah.
He had that amazing long hair.
Yeah, he did, that's right. So that was their version, but even they, and maybe it was an external veneer, I don't know, but they had a serious existential take on it, that, this is the only way to understand the meaning of life, and this is what we're doing to understand the meaning of life, right? And the essence of reality can only be experienced, with this drug in your system and this sort of thing. So they talked a good game,
Yeah.
But there was an element of seriousness in it that is present at IU. It's one of the many colors of the IU palette, but there was more of that.
Yeah, I think it's just, for me, it's just everything in moderation, even moderation.
Moderation and moderation, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you with, like the classes that you're teaching now, something that you might be known for is you give out lots of readings to students.
I do.
And I wanted to ask, what...
What am I really expecting?
No.
Why do I torture them? I'll let you ask the question.
No, do you find that only with reading this much, can you, maybe I'll change this, but with...
Is there a point to all those readings? Is that what you're asking?
No, of course there is.
Okay, all right.
For students that, would maybe be scared of all the readings, what can reading this much really give them?
Well, much more insight than just hearing something orally, because on paper, an author can expand in much greater detail at much greater length what he's doing, why he's doing it, the assumptions that he's making. So you learn whatever it is you're learning in much greater depth. And you can also learn much more about it. You can get more information than I can convey in what I do in a lecture. So it's another crucial dimension of the learning process.
Yeah, and let me take you back to, do you think you've learned more from reading or actually being in Russia?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah, that's hard to say.
I
certainly learn every minute of every visit that I've made there. But probably if I spent years and years living in Russia, I might say the balance maybe would have gone the other way.
Yeah.
But as it is, I learn a tremendous amount by reading. And also, by the way, talking to Russians or people who've spent time in Russia.
Yeah. Were there any difficulties that you had when you were researching out there?
Yeah.
Can you tell me about some of them?
So, one of my earliest visits with my husband, I can't remember if we were graduate students or if I think we were graduate students. And so first of all, to visit the old Soviet Union, no matter who you were, not no matter who you were, if you came from a Western country, it was very different if you came from Eastern Europe or a few of the Soviet allies in the Third World, such as India or certain African countries, certain Middle Eastern countries with which they had excellent relations. If you came from a Western country, so not only did you need a visa, but you had to submit months in advance a detailed itinerary, and not only by the day but by the hour, really, where you were going to be and whom you were going to be contacting. It was virtually impossible to stay with a family unless it was a relative. or a very close friend whom you could specify in advance, but you couldn't arrange a visit or an Airbnb staying, in someone's home. They went to great lengths to keep Westerners away from Soviet citizens. And this is post-Stalin, but even then I have in mind the Brezhnev era, where there had been liberalization and then a crackdown under Brezhnev, and people were afraid. So if I would get into a conversation with someone, often he would say, let's go to a park.
Okay.
There are no microphones,
Yeah.
right? Let's go to a park.
Wow.
Is because, and people would joke all the time. If you went to their apartment, they would say, the mic's up
The
there.
fly on the
or
wall.
It's up
Yeah.
there. And it probably was, you never knew, depending on how important they were or weren't. It was just assumed that, so you had to submit the hotels, you had to request certain hotels if you wanted to, or they would interest their travel agency for helping people visit the Soviet Union, would tell you if you preferred what hotels. And there were certain very famous hotels known as in-tourist hotels that were extremely plebeian and bare bones, and you just assumed that your hotel room was wired and that any conversation. So the only safe place really was either a very, very noisy restaurant, and then it would be hard to hear, or a park bench, right? And you would just from time to time make sure that there was nobody around, and then you could talk. But even then, people were, so I remember once when we befriended a young man, a student, by the name of Sergei, and Sergei, on day one, brought us to a park bench, and we were talking, and we made plans to meet on day two, and he wasn't there. And it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't because he was busy. And I was never able to get back in touch, so I wrote a couple of letters to Sergei and never heard back. And I can only assume that, that was understood. So my worst experience of all was, I don't think it was that trip with Sergei, it was a different trip, where we submitted this itinerary. And one of the things I most wanted to do, there's some wonderful reconstructed medieval cities around Moscow, not far from Moscow, that are where they really preserved or even rebuilt very, very old structures. And there's one about a half hour's drive away from Moscow. And at that time, we were poor graduate students, and we couldn't afford to, there were very few cars. Only the Communist Party elite had cars. No one else had cars. And so we couldn't have, and there was no real car rental service. They didn't want people driving. They wanted to have you an in-tourist guide who would then take you in his car where you wanted to go. Well, we didn't want to do that. We wanted to be free of the in-tourist minder. So we submitted an itinerary that included going to this particular place, Vladimir. And and again, we had an itinerary by the hour, what time we were expected to arrive and what time we expected to be back, and we were traveling by bus. And we were having a fascinating time. It was absolutely fascinating. We'd arrived by bus, and we made the mistake, being naive, about keeping an eye on a bus schedule. We just assumed that there was going to be a bus going back to Moscow every half hour into the evening. Well, it turned out that the buses stopped running somewhere around 6 o'clock, and we didn't wind up till about 8 or 8:30. We started to get hungry, and there was no restaurant in Vladimir at that time. So we started to get hungry and realized, oops, we better go to the bus station. And we looked at the bus schedule, and I thought maybe we're misunderstanding it. There's some cultural problem. There's maybe the other half of the bus schedule is somewhere else. And I began asking people, and we discovered that there were no more buses that night. There was no place to stay. Bus station was going to lock at 10 o'clock at night. It wasn't that cold, but seemed a bit awkward. And so we were very eager to get back. Now, hitchhiking was very common in Russia. Everybody and anybody, even women by themselves, would often hitchhike. So we thought, well, we'll find, we'll just go to the bus, we'll stay at the bus station, and if anyone drives by or anything, we'll signal to them that we're interested, and see if we can pay somebody to take us back to Moscow. Well, that took about 2 hours, but we eventually found some guy. We didn't really know anything about him, of course. We never do, but we didn't know anything about him. But he sort of stopped when he saw. Oh, another thing I learned on my early trips. So we were wearing, like most graduate students, jeans and a sweatshirt and something, and we thought we didn't look any different from the Russian on the street. Turns out Russians had a very good eye for American jeans and American. So turns out we were immediately marked, aside from our heavily accented, poor Russian. We were immediately marked just by anybody looking at us that we were Westerners and probably Americans. So some guy stopped because he was curious about these two Americans standing there waving and looking for a ride. And he offered, we negotiated and arrived on a price. We got back to Moscow and our hotel at something after midnight. We arrive at the hotel. And so, first of all, Russian hotels. This is still true in some areas, and in some areas of the I don't know if you have that in Kazakhstan. We found it in Tashkent and in Dushanbe in particular, that the hotel, so in a hotel, the doors are such that you don't have a little hotel key or a card. You have a key attached to a very big, sort of, I don't know what to call it, hanger or weight, like a weight. So, for example, a wooden weight that's attached to the key, and you don't take it with you. You don't, as in America and all over most of the world, you don't put it in your wallet or your purse and leave. When you leave, you turn it in. And in many hotels, this was true at that time, still is, I found it also in Dushanbe, it used to be a little lady in black. Now they're a little more diverse, but typically this is something they would give to pensioners, to women. And there'd be a little lady in black who would be sitting at a desk opposite the elevator in every floor of the hotel. And she had behind her a large cabinet with pigeonholes with room numbers underneath. So when you left the hotel, you would give your key with a huge weight on it, and she'd stick it in the right pigeonhole for room 426, that she'd stick it in there. So anyone at a glance could know if somebody is in his room or not, because there's no way you could get into your room without the key. And when you got into your room, you kept your key. But if the key were in the box, you were absent, and it was clear to anybody just briefly scanning it. So in those days, different from today, in those days, they had KGB people who would scan. That was their job, to go around at the closing. So the hotel's locked at a certain fairly early hour, like 10 p.m. And at that point, so first of all, even to get in was a hassle, because you'd have to bang on a door, and the reception area might be, way on the opposite side of the lobby, and maybe nobody would hear you. That was bad enough. So we arrive after midnight, and the place is locked, of course. We expected that. We banged on the door, and finally somebody actually came and opened it. And when they did, there were 3 very tough-looking men standing there like this. One of them turns to us and says, "Where have you been?" And so, they knew we were gone. They knew that was a deviation from our pre-approved itinerary. Well, in the end, nothing happened. Yeah. I mean, we explained what happened, and they said, you should have known, this is obvious, this, that, and the other. You obviously need to be aware of bus schedules. Besides, you had your schedules. If you want to be a visitor in the Soviet Union, you can't continue to behave in this manner. But we were sufficiently meek and mild, that we said, no, we realized it was our mistake. We're really sorry. This went on for about 3/4 of an hour. We weren't sure what would happen, because the first American professor of political science to go to the Soviet Union you couldn't do it in the Stalin era. This is in 1956. He went in the Khrushchev era, was actually arrested. He was working on a book on the Soviet Union, and the manuscript had been circulated, and they decided it wasn't what he liked, and they actually had put him in prison. We knew about it. It was a very famous case. So we knew about that case. So we were just graduate students. He was a professor at Yale. You know, we didn't have that distinction. We were graduate students. But we didn't know, you know, and it so much depended on political vagaries, whether there was something at that time that could be gained from some kind of hostage that they might have. So we were pretty terrified, and in the end it all worked out, but it was not a pleasant experience. Not to endure Soviet life to me, endear Soviet life to me, right.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was very interesting. I mean, you know, never a dull moment, right? Right.
Not one. Wow.
Yeah. Right. So you asked about obstacles.
Yeah.
That's just one. That was really, that one
No.
seared itself on my memory. Yeah.
No, that's amazing. Have you ever told that one to your classrooms?
I don't know, probably at some point.
Yeah.
But yeah.
If there's one thing that a student could be, if there's one thing you'd like to impose on us, or not impose,
Advise?
or give to a student by taking one of your classes.
Oh, you mean how to succeed in a Spechler class? Do the reading.
Oh no.
That's a reason.
There is a lot of reading there.
Right?
Yeah.
Write the paper.
Yeah.
All right. I had to force this guy. Right. Yeah. What did you really want to know?
No. If there's one thing that you'd like to give a student after taking your class.
Oh, I can answer that.
What would it be?
A sustained interest in the rest of the world, particularly given it's my particular slant in politics and international relations. So I always say in my introductory course that it may seem like it's aiming low, but my ambition, you know, teachers are supposed to these days, we're supposed to have course objectives and, you know, goals of the class. I don't know if I've ever had the courage to put it in print because it sounds like I'm not really very ambitious. But my number one goal for my students is that when they leave my class, they read a newspaper and not just the sports section. Okay, so don't rely just on television. Read a newspaper and read about international affairs. So what I try to do is kind of create that kind of interest in the rest of the world, especially political developments and interactions in the rest of the world that will hopefully last them for a lifetime. That's my objective.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
thank you for joining us.
No, you're
That was
welcome.
really great.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
More stories from Moscow.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, that does our interview with Professor Spechler, and hopefully I'll see you next time.
Okay.